The Fall of Rome. It's a story baked into the DNA of Western civilization. A saga of decadence, barbarian invasions, and political rot that we've been telling for 1,600 years. It's the ultimate cautionary tale, a colossal empire, the center of the known world, brought to its knees, its marble temples left to crumble. We all know how the story ends. The final sputtering gasps of an empire that once seemed eternal. But what if that's not the most incredible part of the story? What if the truly insane, the most unbelievable chapter of Rome's history, isn't its death, but its birth? To really get Rome, you have to run the film in reverse. Rewind past the sacked cities and the crumbling frontiers. Go back. Back before the emperors, before the legions that conquered the world, before the marble city itself. Back to a time when Rome was just a handful of muddy huts on a few hills, overlooking a swampy, unremarkable river. How did that become this? How did a tiny village transform into the greatest superpower the world had ever seen? This isn't a story of decline. This is the story of the ascent. A story of mythic origins, savage ambition, and the brutal, brilliant maneuvers that forged a global empire from mud and legend. The story of how it all began, how a tiny village on the Tiber grew to rule the known world, is even more incredible than its famous collapse. To understand the foundation of this mighty empire, we need to rewind past the fall and look at the myths and the men that forged it. And that story starts not with an emperor or a general, but with a pair of abandoned twins and a she-wolf. Every great civilization needs a great origin story, a myth that explains not just where its people came from, but who they are. For the Romans, that story was a brutal epic, drenched in divine blood and human ambition. It begins not in Italy, but in the burning ruins of another great city, Troy. The story the Romans eventually told themselves, written down by poets like Virgil, was that when the Greeks sacked Troy, a hero named Aeneas, son of the goddess Venus, escaped the flames. He carried his elderly father on his shoulders and led his son by the hand, a perfect image of Roman pietas, or duty to family, gods, and country. After years of wandering, Aeneas and his followers finally landed in Italy. There, his descendants established a royal line in the city of Alba Longa. This connection was brilliant PR. It gave the Romans a heroic pedigree, linking their destiny to the age of Greek heroes. It positioned them not as upstarts, but as the rightful heirs to an ancient legacy. But the most famous part of the story comes centuries later. In Alba Longa, the rightful king Numitor was overthrown by his cruel brother Amulius. To secure his throne, Amulius forced Numitor's daughter Rhea Silvia to become a Vestal virgin, a priestess sworn to celibacy. No children, no heirs, no challengers. The gods, however, had other plans. As Rhea Silvia slept, she was visited by Mars himself, the fiery god of war. From this union she gave birth to twin boys, demigods, the sons of war itself. Their names were Romulus and Remus. King Amulius was terrified. He ordered the infants seized and drowned in the Tiber River. But the servant tasked with the job couldn't do it. Instead, he placed the twins in a basket and set them adrift on the current. The river carried the basket downstream until it snagged in the roots of a fig tree. As the waters receded, the crying infants were left on the muddy bank. And this is where the legend gets iconic. A she-wolf, a lupa, heard their cries. Instead of harming them, the wild beast nursed the boys, saving them. The image of two babies suckling from a wolf would become the eternal symbol of Rome, a city born from savagery, nurtured by a fierce, predatory force, yet destined for greatness. Eventually, the twins were found by a shepherd Faustulus, who raised them as his own. They grew up strong, brave, and natural leaders, honing the skills of command that were their birthright. As young men, they learned the truth of their origin. Burning with a desire for justice, they returned to Alba Longa, raised a rebellion, killed the usurper Amulius and restored their grandfather to the throne. But they were destined to build something new. They decided to found their own city on the very hills where the she-wolf had saved them. This is where brotherly love turns to tragic conflict. The twins couldn't agree on who should be king. They couldn't even agree on which hill to build on. Romulus favored the Palatine Hill. Remus chose the Aventine. To settle it, they turned to augury, reading the will of the gods in the flight of birds. Remus saw a sign first. 6 vultures. Victory, he declared. But moments later, Romulus saw 12. A better sign, he argued. More birds meant more divine favor. Who was right, the first sign or the bigger one? The divine message was ambiguous, and their ambition filled the void. As Romulus began plowing a furrow to mark the sacred boundary of his new city, the Pomerium, Remus, in a fit of mockery, jumped over the shallow ditch. It was the ultimate sacrilege. The sacred boundary of a city was inviolable. Enraged, Romulus struck his brother down. The accounts differ on the details, but the result was the same. Remus was dead. Standing over his brother's body, Romulus is said to have declared, "So will it be for all who dare to cross my walls." The city would be strong. It would be defended at any cost. And so, on April 21st, 753 BCE, Romulus became the first king of the city he named after himself, Rome. This foundational myth is a chilling prophecy of Rome's character. A city born of divine heritage and brutal fratricide. A civilization that would value strength and order above all else. It's a fantastic story. Divine conception. A she-wolf nurse. A hero who murders his brother to found a city. It's the kind of epic a civilization would tell about itself. But is any of it true? This is where we move from myth to the gritty reality of archaeology. This is where we dig for the real story in the mud of the Tiber. For centuries, the story of Romulus and Remus was taken as pretty much fact. Roman historians like Livy wrote it down as the start of their history. The date, 753 BCE, was set in stone and became the official starting point of the Roman calendar. Abi Orb Candida, from the founding of the city. Modern historians, of course, are a bit more skeptical. First, the story itself feels familiar. A hero twin abandoned in a river, saved, and rising to greatness? It's a classic folktale. Figures like Sargon of Akkad in Mesopotamia and Moses in the Bible have remarkably similar origins. It's an archetype for a legendary founder, not necessarily a unique historical event. Plus, the name Romulus is a little too convenient. It almost certainly was invented later to explain the city's name, Rome, not the other way around. It's like finding a city called Metropolis and inventing a founder named Metro. So, if Romulus probably didn't exist, what does the hard evidence tell us? For a long time, the academic consensus was that the myth was just that, a myth. But then, archaeologists started digging on the Palatine Hill, the very spot where Romulus supposedly built his city, and they found something fascinating. They unearthed the remains of Iron Age huts dating back to the 9th and 8th centuries, BCE. This means there was a settlement on the Palatine Hill right around the traditional founding date of 753 BCE. While it doesn't prove a man named Romulus built it, it confirms the legend picked the right time and place. Even more exciting, archaeologists found evidence of a defensive wall and ditch at the foot of the Palatine from that same period. This suggests the early inhabitants felt the need to fortify their settlement a real world. Echo of Romulus plowing his sacred boundary. The reality of Rome's origin was likely less a single traumatic event and more a gradual merging. The famous 7 Hills were originally a collection of separate, small hilltop villages, probably inhabited by Latin-speaking peoples. They settled on the hills for a simple reason. The surrounding area was a swamp. The hills were the only safe, defensible ground. The location was also a stroke of strategic genius, even if they didn't know it yet. The site is about 15 miles inland, safe from pirates, but close enough for trade. More importantly, it sat at the only good place to cross the Tiber River in the entire region. Any trade moving north or south had to pass by them. Control the crossing, and you control the commerce. Over time, these separate villages began to trade and eventually merge. They drained the swampy valley between the Palatine and Capitoline hills, which would become the heart of their new, unified city, the Roman Forum. This process, called synocism, wasn't the work of one man. It was a slow coming together over generations. So where did the myth come from? The story of Romulus and Remus likely began to take shape around the 4th century BCE. As Rome was starting to flex its muscles on the Italian peninsula, they needed a national identity. The story served a purpose. Making their founder the son of Mars defined them as a warrior people by divine right. The murder of Remus served as a grim justification for political violence in the name of the state. In the end, the truth lies somewhere between the myth and the mud. No, there probably wasn't a demigod raised by a wolf. But the legend captures an essential truth. Rome was a community forged in a tough environment, where survival depended on strength, and where a collection of villages united to become something powerful. The myth wasn't history. It was a mission statement. And it was a mission they would pursue with terrifying efficiency. Before Rome was a republic, and long before it was an empire, it was a kingdom. Tradition says that after Romulus, 6 other kings ruled the city, a period lasting nearly 250 years, from 753 to 509 BCE. Like Romulus, the tales of these kings are a potent mix of legend and history. The accounts we have were written hundreds of years later, so they're best seen as how the Romans chose to remember their past. Archaeology does confirm, however, that Rome grew from a village into a true city-state during this period, so powerful leaders-kings were almost certainly guiding it. The traditional list of 7 kings is likely a simplification. Their average reigns are suspiciously long. It's more likely that there were more kings, and their stories were condensed into a symbolic 7. After the warlike Romulus, who set up the Senate, tradition says the throne passed to Numa Pompilius. Numa was the polar opposite of Romulus. He was a man of peace and piety. He's credited with creating Rome's religious life, the festival calendar, the major priesthoods, and the Temple of Janus, whose doors were open in times of war and closed in times of peace. During Numa's long reign, the doors stayed shut. He gave Rome its spiritual backbone. Next came Tullus Hostilius, and the pendulum swung violently back to war. As his name suggests, he was hostile. His reign was marked by constant fighting, most famously against Alba Longa, the mother city. Legend says the war was decided by a duel between 3 Roman brothers, the Horatii, and 3 Alban brothers, the Curiatii. The last Horatius brother standing won the fight, and Rome absorbed Alba Longa, doubling its population and cementing its dominance. Tullus also built the first Senate house, the Curia Hostilia. The 4th king, Ancus Marcius, was Numa's grandson and struck a balance between peace and aggression. His big contributions were to infrastructure. He's said to have built the first bridge across the Tiber, the Pons Sublicius, and founded the port city of Ostia, giving Rome its first outlet to the sea and control over valuable salt flats. This was a key step in turning Rome into a hub for trade. The reign of the 5th king, Lucius Tarquinius Priscus, marks a major turning point. His name suggests he was an Etruscan, from the more advanced civilization to the north. His rise signals a period of major Etruscan influence over Rome. Tarquin Priscus brought Etruscan engineering to the city on a grand scale. He's the guy credited with 2 of Rome's greatest hits. The Cloaca Maxima, the greatest sewer which drained the swampy Forum and made it a usable city center, and the Circus Maximus, the great chariot racing track that would be an entertainment hub for 1,000 years. The 6th king, Servius Tullius, supposedly started life as a slave in the palace. An omen of harmless flames dancing around his head as a child marked him for greatness. Servius was a great reformer. He completely reorganized the army and Roman society based on wealth, not birth. A citizen's military duty and voting power were now tied to their property. This tied the state's military strength directly to its economic health. He also conducted Rome's first census and is credited with building the massive Servian Wall, a huge new set of defenses that enclosed a much larger area of the city, defining its new boundaries. The seventh and final king was Lucius Tarquinius Superbus, or Tarquin the Proud. He seized power by murdering his father-in-law, Servius Tullius. His own wife, Tullia, then grotesquely ran over her father's body with a chariot. This set the tone for his reign. Tarquin the Proud was a classic tyrant. He ruled through fear, executing senators and ignoring the law. While he was a successful military commander who completed the great temple of Jupiter, his despotic behavior alienated everyone. The Romans were growing powerful, but they were chafing under the boot of a tyrant. The situation was a powder keg, waiting for a spark. The end of the monarchy wasn't a gradual transition. It was a violent revolution, sparked by a single act of brutality that became the foundational story of the new republic. The trigger was the rape of a noblewoman named Lucretia. The story goes that while the army was away, the king's son, Sextus Tarquinius, and his cousins were drunkenly debating whose wife was the most virtuous. They rode back to Rome to check. They found the royal princesses partying, but Lucretia, wife of Collatinus, was at home, dutifully spinning wool. She was declared the model of Roman virtue. But Sextus Tarquinius was inflamed with a vicious lust. A few days later, he returned to Lucretia's house alone. Late that night, he snuck into her chamber and threatened to kill her if she didn't submit. When she refused, unintimidated by death, he made a more evil threat. He would kill her and a male slave, place their bodies together, and claim he'd caught her in adultery. For Lucretia, this was worse than death. Her honor and her family's reputation would be destroyed. Faced with this unbearable shame, she submitted. The next day, she summoned her father, her husband, and their friend, Lucius Junius Brutus. She told them what happened. Despite their pleas that she was blameless, she could not be consoled. After making them swear an oath of vengeance, she drew a hidden dagger and took her own life. This was the final straw. Brutus, who had long pretended to be a harmless fool to avoid the paranoid king, was galvanized. He drew the bloody dagger from Lucretia's chest and swore an oath to drive the Tarquins from Rome and ensure no man would ever be king in Rome again. They carried Lucretia's body to the Forum for all to see. As Brutus recounted the crime and the king's many abuses, the people erupted in rage. An uprising swept the city. When King Tarquin rushed back, he found the gates locked. He and his sons were forced into exile, the last kings to ever rule Rome. The year was 509 BCE. The monarchy was dead. But what would replace it? Led by Brutus, the revolutionaries created a new system, the res publica, literally, the public thing. Instead of a king for life, they would elect 2 consuls to serve for just 1 year. Each consul could veto the other, a brilliant system of checks and balances. The Senate, which Tarquin had abused, was restored as the primary advisory body, and popular assemblies were given the power to elect magistrates and vote on war and peace. This new republic was an ingenious mix of monarchy, aristocracy, and democracy, but it was far from perfect. It was heavily weighted in favor of the wealthy elite, the patricians. This inequality led to 2 centuries of intense social struggle with the common people, the plebeians, known as the conflict of the orders. This fight for rights would ultimately reshape the republic. The story of Lucretia, whether entirely historical or not, became the republic's sacred founding narrative. It defined what the republic stood against tyranny and unchecked power, and what it stood for: honor, liberty, and the rule of law. The overthrow of the monarchy set Rome on a new path, creating a political machine that, while often messy, proved remarkably resilient and astonishingly effective at projecting power. The Roman Republic was forged in revolution, but its rise was fueled by its military. The Roman army was the heart of the state, a brutally efficient machine for expansion, unlike anything the world had ever seen. In the early days, the army was a citizen militia, fighting in a rigid Greek-style phalanx. But in the hilly terrain of Italy, the phalanx was too clumsy. So the Romans developed a new system, the manipular legion. The legion was broken into smaller, more flexible units called maniples, deployed in a checkerboard pattern of 3 lines. This setup was genius. It allowed the legion to adapt to any terrain. The front line could engage, then fall back through the gaps to let the fresh second line take over. If things got really desperate, the third line of grizzled veterans, the triarii, would kneel to form a final, impenetrable wall of spears. The situation was so dire when this happened that the phrase, "it has come to the triarii," became Roman slang for being in deep trouble. The individual legionary was a walking weapon system. He had a large, curved shield, scutum, a short, stabbing sword for close quarters work, gladius, and his signature weapon, the pilum. This was a heavy javelin designed with a soft iron shank. When it hit an enemy's shield, the shank would bend, making it impossible to pull out. The shield was now useless, right as the Roman charge crashed home. But what truly set the Roman army apart was its relentless discipline and engineering. Soldiers would march 20 miles a day, carrying all their gear, then build a fully fortified camp from scratch every night. This discipline was enforced with brutal punishment. With this machine, Rome began its expansion. First came the conquest of Italy. For over a century, Rome fought its neighbors. But Rome didn't just defeat its enemies. It systematically incorporated them as citizens or allies. Its power grew with every victory, and so did its manpower pool. By 264 BCE, Rome was the master of Italy, though some pockets of resistance held out for a few more decades. But now it came face to face with another superpower, the great naval empire of Carthage. The clash between these two titans was inevitable. The result was the Punic Wars, a series of 3 epic conflicts for control of the Mediterranean that lasted over a century. The Punic Wars pushed Rome to the absolute brink. In the Second Punic War, the brilliant Carthaginian general Hannibal Barca marched an army, complete with elephants, from Spain, over the Alps, and into Italy. At the Battle of Cannae in 216 BCE, he inflicted one of the worst defeats in military history on Rome, completely encircling and slaughtering a massive Roman army. Any other state would have surrendered, but Rome refused to break. Drawing on vast reserves of manpower and iron will, the Romans adopted a strategy of avoiding direct battle with Hannibal and wearing him down. Finally, the Roman general Scipio took the fight to Africa, forcing Hannibal to return home. At the Battle of Zama, Scipio defeated Hannibal, ending the war and making Rome the dominant power in the Mediterranean. After a third Punic War ended with the complete destruction of Carthage in 146 BC, Rome was the master of the West. In the very same year, they also conquered the Greek city-states. A regional power had become the master of the known world. But this constant warfare had planted the seeds of the Republic's own destruction, creating the conditions for a century of bloody civil war that would transform Rome once again. Section 6. The Republic breaks. The rise of the warlords. Rome's conquests made it fabulously wealthy, but its political system, designed for a city-state, was cracking under the strain of ruling an empire. The vast influx of wealth and slaves created a huge, restless urban poor in Rome, and successful generals started to gain more power and prestige than the Senate itself. This was the age of the warlords. The first to truly break the old model was Gaius Marius. A brilliant general from outside the aristocracy, Marius was elected consul, an unprecedented 7 times. Facing a manpower shortage, he enacted reforms around 107 BCE that changed Rome forever. He abolished the rule that soldiers had to own land, allowing the poor to enlist for the first time. This had 2 massive consequences. First, it created a professional army. These soldiers served long terms and looked to their general, not the state, for pay, gear, and their retirement bonus of land. This created private armies, loyal to one man. Second, when the Senate refused to grant Marius's veterans their promised land, he used the threat of his loyal troops to force the law through. This set a terrifying precedent. An army could be used to intimidate the government. The man who took this precedent to its logical conclusion was Marius's bitter rival, Lucius Cornelius Sulla. In 88 BCE, when the Senate gave him command of a major war, his enemies had the command transferred to Marius. Sulla's response was unthinkable. He did what no Roman had ever dared. He marched his legions on Rome itself. After winning his war in the east, Sulla returned to fight a full-scale civil war. He emerged victorious in 82 BCE and marched on Rome a second time. What followed was a reign of terror. Sulla had himself made dictator with no term limit, granting him absolute power. He unleashed the proscriptions, publishing lists of his enemies who could be legally hunted down and killed for a reward. He thought he was saving the Republic. In reality, he wrote the blueprint for its destruction. He proved that ultimate power in Rome came not from votes, but from legions. The next generation learned that lesson all too well. 3 men rose to dominate the Republic's final decades: the fabulously wealthy Crassus, the military hero Pompey the Great, and a charismatic young politician from an old patrician family, Gaius Julius Caesar. In 60 BCE, they formed the first triumvirate, a backroom deal to pool their power and control the state. The alliance sent Caesar to conquer Gaul. For nearly a decade, he waged a brilliant and brutal war, amassing a fortune, becoming a popular hero, and forging a battle-hardened, fanatically loyal army. Back in Rome, the triumvirate collapsed. Crassus was killed, and Pompey grew fearful of Caesar's power. In 49 BCE, the Senate, pushed by Pompey, ordered Caesar to disband his army and return to Rome as a private citizen. It was a death sentence. Caesar stood with his legion on the banks of the Rubicon River, the legal boundary of his province. To cross it with an army was treason. With the words, "Alia iacta est," the die is cast, he crossed the river and plunged the Roman world into civil war. The war was swift. At the Battle of Pharsalus, Caesar's veterans crushed Pompey's larger army. By 45 BCE, the war was over. Caesar returned to Rome as the undisputed master of the Roman world, eventually declared dictator perpetuo dictator for life. But his absolute power alarmed many in the Senate. They saw him as a tyrant. On the Ides of March, 44 BCE, a group of senators, led by Brutus and Cassius, stabbed Caesar to death. They thought killing the tyrant would restore the Republic. They were fatally wrong. The assassination triggered 13 more years of civil war. The power vacuum was filled by Caesar's right-hand man, Mark Antony, and his surprise heir, his 19-year-old grandnephew, Gaius Octavius, whom Caesar had adopted in his will. Known to history as Octavian, the young man was cool, calculating, and ruthless. After joining forces with Antony to defeat Caesar's assassins, their alliance broke down into a final struggle for power. The end came at the naval battle of Actium. In 31 BC, the Octavian's forces defeated the combined fleets of Antony and his lover, Queen Cleopatra of Egypt. At 32, Octavian was the sole ruler of the entire Roman world. The century of civil wars was over. The Roman Republic was dead. A new era was dawning, and Octavian, the last warlord, would now become Rome's first emperor. He would soon take a new name, one that would echo through eternity. Augustus. The rise was complete. The empire had begun. If you want to know more about the insane lives of the men who broke the Republic, check out our video on the civil war between Caesar and Pompey. And as always, subscribe and hit the bell so you don't miss our next journey into the most epic stories from history. From a mythical wolf and a pair of brothers to a small collection of huts on a muddy riverbank. From a city ruled by kings to a republic defined by liberty. From a citizen army to a war machine that dominated the world. And finally, from a republic torn apart by the ambition of its greatest sons to the rise of a single, all-powerful emperor. The rise of Rome wasn't one story, but 1,000 woven together. It was a story of myth-making, political innovation, and social struggle. It was a story of unparalleled military prowess and groundbreaking engineering. The Romans built an empire not just with the sword, but with concrete, with roads that stitched the world together, and with a system of law that turned conquered enemies into Roman allies. It was a brutal, violent, and often cruel ascent, but it was also one of the most remarkable achievements in history. The fall of Rome echoes as a warning, but its rise remains a testament to the enduring power of ambition, organization, and the indomitable will to not just build a city, but to build the world.